Right, sorry.
Hello there, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you. We'll just give it a couple more minutes before we get those numbers hopefully bumped up, and then we'll make a start.
While you wait, we'll be asking this of you in a bit, but if you want to put in the chat box any of your concerns about working with your MP on climate change, we can maybe have a little chat just as we're starting off.
Good morning, Terry. It's a pleasure to have you here. Hope it's excellent weather in Burton. Hello to those of you just joining us. We really appreciate your time today. We'll just leave it another minute or so, and then we'll make a start. Okay, it's 12:04. I'm conscious, obviously we're 4 minutes over time now, so we will make a start. Apologies that you're having some troubles accessing the session, Ross. If you, just maybe log out and kind of log back in. Hopefully that should alleviate any issues you're having. But yes, it's a huge good afternoon from me. It's great to have everybody here today. My name's Tom, and I'm joined today by my colleague Hannah from Hope for the Future, and by Izzy, who is the Senior Campaign Manager at the Zero Carbon Campaign. Hope for the Future is a climate communications and democratic engagement charity focused on equipping individuals and groups all across the UK with the tools they need to communicate the urgency of climate change with their elected representatives. The Zero Carbon Campaign is a campaigning organisation arguing for fair and effective carbon pricing and stronger legal climate protections. And the three of us are here today to deliver a session on how to build effective relationships with your MPs on climate change, with the specific goal of engaging them on carbon pricing. This will be a 90-minute session with a short break in between, and please feel free to submit any questions you may have at any point in the chat box. And if you don't, and if we will be able to answer them, and if we can't answer them all at the end, then we will be more than happy to speak on a one-to-one basis afterwards. Okay, so we will kick off this session and get it underway. Just a few kind of introductory bits to go through. First of all, we always like to reiterate that life does not stop for Zoom calls, and we want all of you here today to be safe in the knowledge that we welcome all interruptions, including every single one from this list. So I will just give a very brief moment for you to take these in, and then we'll move on to today's session. Okay, that's excellent. So just a brief kind of overview of what we're going to cover today. So first of all, Izzy is going to take us through an introduction to carbon pricing before Hannah and I move on to discussing communicating with empathy, and before we go on to discussing our relationship-based approach in terms of how we approach MP engagement. That will cover the 4 themes that you can see listed on that list. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Izzy.
Thanks so much, Tom. As Tom said, I'm Izzy. I'm a senior campaign manager at the Zero Carbon campaign. And as a campaign, we work to promote fairer, stronger and more consistent carbon pricing as a critical decarbonisation tool. Today, I'm going to spend some time deconstructing what that actually means and what we as citizens can do to support its implementation. So firstly, it's worth clarifying what we mean when we say carbon pricing. At its core, carbon pricing means attaching a price to the production of carbon dioxide and equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, exactly as the name suggests. However, if you scratch below the surface, then pinning down precisely what carbon pricing is becomes a bit more complex. And as a campaign, one of our objectives is to try and present carbon pricing in a way that's accessible so that its potential can be better understood. I hope we managed to achieve that today, but if we do lose you at any point, then please don't hesitate to raise your virtual hand and ask questions. And as Tom said, we'll come to them either at the end or afterwards. So the reason carbon pricing can be complicated is because it doesn't refer to just one idea. Rather, it's an umbrella term for a whole range of what we might describe as market-based decarbonisation mechanisms. What these market-based decarbonisation mechanisms all share is the objective of reducing overall greenhouse gas emissions by incentivising greener and more sustainable ways of doing business and disincentivising unsustainable polluting behaviours. And they all do this by setting a price per unit of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere, ensuring that those who produce pollution pay the price for the damage they cause to the environment. The potential for carbon pricing to drive down global emissions has earned it many advocates, including senior international figures such as New Zealand and Canadian Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and Justin Trudeau, French President Emmanuel Macron, and Antonio Guterres, the UN's Secretary General, who you can see quoted there. And carbon pricing isn't just good for driving down emissions, it can also help create a number of other co-benefits for our health and well-being by ensuring that those who are most responsible for pollution are held to account for the damage they're causing to the planet. For example, fossil fuel-related air pollution kills 64,000 people in the UK every year, and this is partly sustained by the financial support that the government continues to provide to fossil fuels via public subsidies. According to the European Commission, this amounts to around £10.5 billion every year. Carbon pricing can play a key role in tackling this by forcing governments to phase out fossil fuel subsidies and ensuring that the emphasis is on polluters to change their business models and start investing in decarbonisation, rather than putting all the pressure on individuals. This is a tactic that oil and gas companies have used for years to try and prevent public scrutiny of their own contribution to climate change. BP's invention of the carbon footprint to try and shift responsibility for global warming onto consumers is perhaps the most famous example of this, but there are many others. We regard these smoke and mirror tactics as a form of distraction. Of course, we all need to change our behaviour to help save the planet, but ordinary people can't reasonably ask to do this until polluting ways of producing and consuming are made more expensive than green ones. And that's a job for businesses and governments. So in summary, carbon pricing encourages people to make greener choices by making polluting ways of producing and consuming more expensive. But how does this actually work? The answer to that question depends on what type of carbon pricing system a government opts for. There are 2 main types of carbon pricing system: emissions trading systems and fixed carbon prices, sometimes referred to as carbon taxes. The approach each system takes to determining the price per tonne of CO2 is quite different, but in general, both tend to put the price of carbon upstream, that is, at the point at which emissions are released into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. This makes paying the carbon price the responsibility of the producer or business, although they almost always pass the cost down to the consumer so that there's a price of purchase signalling. In the next two slides, we'll take a look at the two main carbon pricing systems in more detail, starting with emissions trading systems, or as they're shortened, ETSs. Sometimes called cap and trade systems, ETSs work by issuing a fixed number of carbon permits, which allow the holder to emit 1 unit of carbon. Individuals and organisations which hold these permits can use them to produce a certain amount of greenhouse gas emissions, but if they have any left over, they can also sell them on the open market. Likewise, if an individual or organisation finds that they need to emit more greenhouse gases than they have permits for, they can attempt to buy them on the open market as well. In a well-designed ETS, the number of permits available will always be tied to a country's emission targets, and fewer permits will be issued each year to drive decarbonisation. This means, in effect, that the price of carbon should rise as time goes on and as the supply of permits become more scarce. ETS's supporters argue that this approach to carbon pricing allows businesses to figure out where best to cut emissions with the least impact on consumers and the wider economy, whilst allowing the market, rather than politicians, to determine the carbon price. The alternative to an ETS is a fixed carbon price, or as I've said before, a carbon tax. In our view, a fixed carbon price has a few advantages over an ETS. One reason to consider a fixed carbon price is that there are many complexities of an emissions trading approach which can have counterintuitive outcomes. For instance, in the EU's ETS, there is a surplus of permits which has significantly distorted the carbon price, hampering its ability to reduce emissions. A fixed carbon price also allows you to set a long-term price trajectory against which businesses can make investment decisions, and that gives them the confidence to invest in greener choices. Another benefit is that a fixed carbon price will bring in revenue to the Treasury, which could be redirected towards a variety of causes, including funding climate mitigation measures like tree planting and carbon capture, and supporting households as they deal with the costs of carbonisation. This could be achieved by providing direct payments or carbon dividends to low and middle income households, as well as investing the money raised from fixed carbon prices to help support people with making the switch to green lifestyle alternatives like low carbon heating and electric vehicles. We've conducted research that shows fixed carbon prices could raise as much as £27 billion per year by 2030, enough to cover the entire budgets of the Department for Transport and the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs combined, with around £900 million left over afterwards. So there are two main different types of carbon pricing systems, ETSs and fixed carbon prices. There are pros and cons to both, which can be applied on their own or in tandem as a hybrid system, i.e. by applying a fixed price to fuel use, but enabling certain industries to trade carbon credits on the open market. Regardless of what exact approach is used, it's important that there is a minimum price per tonne of carbon equivalent emitted. The research I referenced earlier also found that in order for us to get on track to achieve the Paris Agreement, we need to ensure that carbon prices reach a minimum of £75 per tonne of greenhouse gas emissions produced by 2030. And finally, there's the issue of carbon leakage. Carbon leakage refers to the offshoring of carbon emissions. When companies and manufacturers face especially stringent domestic carbon pricing policies, they may elect to move their production processes overseas. This is not just an issue in terms of domestic job creation, but also in terms of global warming. We need to reduce the emissions that are being produced across the world, not just move them to somewhere we don't have responsibility for them. A border carbon adjustment is a great way of addressing concerns about carbon leakage without having to resort to subsidy. A border carbon adjustment enables you to apply a domestic carbon price to imports at the country or jurisdiction border, so that competitors face the same carbon price as the domestic producer. This ensures carbon pricing does not drive emissions abroad and that other jurisdictions are incentivized to develop their own carbon pricing policies. Because, let's face it, most countries would rather pay a carbon price to their own government, not to somebody else's. Given the complexities of BCAs, it's really helpful to have a degree of multilateral, i.e. more than one country, support before you implement one, such that countries with equivalent carbon prices can trade with each other in carbon bubbles without having to adjust costs at the border or enter into complex trade agreements. So that's the basics of carbon pricing. But before I hand back to Josh and Hannah, I just want to Tom and Hannah, I just want to wrap up the introduction with a note on the UK's current approach to carbon pricing and why we're campaigning for it to be strengthened. The European Union has one of the most extensive emissions trading schemes in the world, originally launched in 2005. The UK was a part of this for a long time, but when the UK left the EU on the 1st of January in 2021, it also separated from the EU ETS to create its own, the UK ETS. The precise details of how the UK ETS work are still to be confirmed, but we do know that the UK's current carbon pricing system as a whole is, one, very complex and overlapping, with very high carbon price signals in some sectors and very low ones in others. Two, riddled with exemptions, with lots of sectors receiving subsidies in the form of free pollution permits, which means that many polluters don't actually pay for the damage they do. Three, incomplete, with key sectors like agriculture and waste disposal exempted from paying carbon prices. And four, unaligned to our climate goals, with neither the ETS price or other effective carbon prices high enough so as to be aligned with our net zero target. Moreover, revenues from UK carbon pricing are not ring-fenced for specific purposes. This prevents them from being able to play an active role in decarbonisation or in supporting households to make the switch to low-carbon lifestyle choices. Failing to ring-fence revenues also deprives the public of the chance to see and understand one of carbon pricing's core benefits, that is, its revenue-raising potential.
Thank you so much for that, Izzy. That was such a good coverage of like everything you need to know about the current situation and what the UK can do. So just before we kind of kick into how to lobby your MP, I'd love to kind of hear everyone's thoughts in the chat box on your concerns with working with your MPs. We're going to just keep going and maybe we'll just like acknowledge them as we go along. Hopefully we'll manage to address a lot of those concerns. Although Terry has already posted one in the chat and I'm not sure how we could address that apart from to continue to lobby your MP and keep reminding them that it's a very important issue. So yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts and I'm going to crack on. So we're going to talk about communicating with empathy because it's the sort of basis of what we do at Hope for the Future. It's the heart of our entire approach. And at Hope for the Future, when it was like first starting out, what we realized is that there was a lot of communication breakdown between constituents and MPs. So we've got a little video to demonstrate this rise in adversarial politics. And it's a video which some of you might be familiar with. It's Jeremy Paxman interviewing an MP. I'm just going to make sure that my screen share can have video, can have audio, just share sound, perfect.
Lewis told him what we had decided about Marriott and why he, that is you, exploded. Simply moving the governor was politically unpalatable. It sounded indecisive. It would be seen as a fudge. If I did not change my mind and suspend Marriott, he would have to consider overruling me.
Mr. Marriott,
you can't both be right.
Mr. Marriott was not suspended. I was entitled to express my views. I was entitled to be consulted.
Did you threaten to overrule
I
him?
was not entitled to instruct Derek Lewis, and I did not instruct him. And
Did you threaten to overrule him?
The truth of the matter is that Mr. Marriott was not suspended.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
I did not overrule Derek Lewis.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
I took advice on what I could or could not do.
Did you threaten to overrule him, Mr. Howard?
Scrupulously in accordance with that advice. I did not overrule Derek Lewis.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
Mr. Marriott was not suspended.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
I have accounted for my decision to dismiss Derek Lewis.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
Detail before the House of Commons.
I note you're not answering the question whether you threatened to overrule him.
The important aspect of this, which it's very clear to bear in mind.
I'm sorry, I'm going to be frightfully rude, but
yes, you can.
I'm sorry. It's a quick, straight yes or no.
Question and I will give you an answer.
Did you threaten to overrule him?
I discussed this matter with Derek Lewis.
So there you have it. Hopefully none of you recognise that too much from your own experiences with your MPs. But that's Jeremy Paxman questioning an MP by repeating the same question over and over again. And what that is essentially is a breakdown in communication. It's a really important, you know, like as a journalist, your role in society, the way that you interact with politicians is very different from as a constituent where you're trying to lobby them. And this idea of adversarial politics and this being the way that campaigners should approach their MPs, it's just not a good role model. It's not a good way to have an effective, productive conversation.
Lewis told him what we had decided.
Again, sorry about that. So hopefully you might have seen some of these behaviours in that conversation. And what we see all the time is these defensive behaviours, both from MPs and from campaigners, that results in this breakdown of conversation. I'm just going to go through them very, very quickly. You can kind of go back and look at them. You'll surely recognise some of them. So things with MPs like repeatedly holding the party line, refusing to kind of have a conversation outside of that, controlling the conversation towards places you want to go. I think both of those are perfectly exemplified in that interview. We also sometimes see MPs really show inattention, like show that they're disengaging from the conversation. One time, my colleague was in a meeting with an MP and they answered their phone halfway through the meeting and had a conversation with their wife about how they wanted their wife to like pick up some milk on the way home. So that kind of thing of like demonstrating you're not at all, like not listening, or just simply not listening at all, not even just demonstrating it, is another defensive behavior. And then we've got stuff on the other side. So like sweet talking you, saying like, oh, I just think everything that you're doing is fantastic, instead of agreeing to a commitment. And a feigning surprise, we once had 3 different MP meetings, and there was one person who went to all 3 of them with the same MP. And each time the MP said, oh, I had no idea about this issue. It's a total surprise to me. I can't believe that this is happening. And then the third one, the constituent was like, I think you can believe this is happening because this is the 3rd time this has happened. So we see some of that, but it's also important to remember communication is always a 2-way street. And that we also see these campaigner defensive behaviors that can really derail a conversation, result in that breakdown. So things like really honing immediately onto a controversial issue, just going to make an MP feel immediately very defensive. Deliberately exposing knowledge gaps. We're going to talk a lot about empathizing with your MP, but MPs are generalists. They're like the GPs of the political world. They don't know everything, and to deliberately expose that and to make them feel bad about it, shame them for it, isn't going to result in a good conversation. Other things like attacking an MP's party about something that the MP, you don't know if the MP agrees with it, being really dismissive or cynical, and again, just controlling the conversation, not listening to the MP, just always pulling it back to where you are. We once had a constituent go into a meeting and then talk for 20 minutes, the whole meeting, and the MP never got a word in edgeways. And then they left the meeting and they were like, I can't believe my MP didn't commit to anything. But they just didn't have time. The MP wasn't able to. So that's the kind of background. These are the sort of the don'ts, the reason that we do this training, the reason that we have the Hope for the Future approach. So moving away from that, we'll look at kind of where we want to be. So Hope for the Future is really based on nonviolent communication, which is a way of communicating, and a book written by Marshall Rosenberg, it's based on this assumption that all human beings have a capacity for compassion and a capacity for empathy, and that people are only resorting to harmful behaviors towards others because they don't recognize more effective strategies of meeting their needs. So what we're doing is we're learning to hear our own deeper needs and the needs of others, and then practice a deeper, concrete set of skills that means that you can build a better relationship. I'm just going to highlight this quote that's on the page because I really think it says everything about what MVC is about. So it's founded on language and communication skills that strengthen our ability to remain human, even under trying conditions. That sounds very sort of floaty. I would recommend reading the book if you have some time. But we're just going to kind of look at the broad strokes, what MVC kind of looks like, what does it mean? What it means is moving away from things like making a moralistic judgment or a comparison. So saying things like to your MP, like, you're so selfish, or you don't care about the planet. And also it means like stopping abdicating any responsibility for our actions, our reactions, our behaviors. Stop saying, I'm angry, you made me angry, or I did this because I had to, those kind of things. Because that's just externalizing responsibility for our behavior and denying our own agency to respond to situations. And then finally, we want to be moving away from making demands. And by this, we mean a scenario where the only option for responding is either yes or no. It removes any possibility for dialogue. It stops the opportunity for collaboration. So instead of that, we want to be moving towards observing situations and making neutral statements of what you're actually observing, and standing on that neutral common ground. And then from there, expressing pure emotions that are triggered, instead of just put what you perceive in a situation. So instead of saying, I feel insulted, you might say, so I feel insulted about how my MP voted. You might say, I felt sad about what you said in Parliament, which is more owning your own responses and owning your own feelings. And then from there, acknowledging our needs and the needs of others. And that can be needs as basic as shelter, the ability to heat your house, and as complicated as you know, a need for order, a need for appreciation, those kind of things. And then finally moving into, instead of making demand, moving into the space of making requests. So things that are made in the present, things that are very doable, they're specific, and things that are negotiated and decided collaboratively. And again, we've got another really good quote on here. We're not saying that your MP is a monster, but this quote is, people who seem like monsters are simply human beings whose language and behavior keeps us from seeing their humanness. And it's about looking for that humanness in another person and looking for that real human connection. So, you know, you can see there's this big thread of empathy. So let's like take a little moment and look at why we should be empathizing with MPs. Again, I'm just going to cover this quite quickly, but just put your feet into an MP's shoes for a second. Being an MP is a very, very high profile job. You get more scrutiny than pretty much any other job in the UK. And there's really, really heavy time restraints as well. I'm going to show you a little timetable in a second of an MP's calendar. It's just massive. It feels like my head's going to explode. Again, they're the generalists of the political world. They've got this really broad knowledge, but they need to know about immigration one day and the details of, you know, waste disposal the next day, infrastructure. They just need to know a little bit about every single thing, like in the UK and abroad, which means that they're often lacking this detail, unless it's a topic that they're really, really like focused on. Just like us, MPs can often feel really helpless. They're trying to tackle a global issue or even just a national issue, and they're just one local MP. And we've had MPs say things like that to us, like, I'd love to take more action on this, but I just think I can't do any more. There's nothing I can do. And that can feel really like scary and like make you feel very helpless and very insecure. And then again, like MPs are constrained by the party line, regardless of if they agree with every issue on that party line. They have to be very aware of their perspective, like how people vote for them and how they're seen by different people. And also MPs sometimes have poor perceptions of campaigners. And that might be for lots of reasons. It might just simply be a prejudice. It might be that someone shouted in their face. We don't know that, and we have to understand that that's the place that they're starting from, and empathize with the fact that they probably feel a bit overwhelmed and a bit stressed when they're talking to campaigners. So as promised, here's the stressful calendar. So on this, the blue is parliamentary business, so anything that they're doing in London in Parliament. The green is constituency matters, and there's little bits of pink. So you'll notice this is a real MP's calendar from just before the pandemic. So hence everything being outside of the house. But you'll notice that Sunday afternoon is the only free time that's truly free for a long chunk of time. It's running from 8 AM until 8 PM or 9 PM. And it's just so much stuff left, right and center coming for them all the time. That's just stressful. You don't get a lot of space to think. You don't get a lot of time to be like considering deeper matters. And it's just a bit overwhelming. So yeah, that's the reason of why you should be doing this, empathizing with your MPs, thinking about how they're feeling. And we're going to now sort of move in, and Tom's going to start talking about how we approach that.
Thank you, Hannah. That's brilliant. Yes, so as Hannah just touched on, I'm going to go over the first element of our relationship-based approach that we use at Hope for the Future, and that is researching your MP. The first thing we always like to do in this section is to essentially show you this quote by the writer Ken Hamer, which simply, illustrates the importance of knowing really who your audience is beforehand in order to know how to generate the most effective response and reaction from them. Obviously, we are not encouraging writing love letters to your members of parliament. It's simply, again, to illustrate that if you can get to know a bit about them on a personal level, then that will really help to garner that much more effective response when you're engaging with them. Robert Halfon, in the bottom right-hand corner, who is a Conservative Member of Parliament, also said that if you want to successfully lobby your MP, then make it personal and make it local. And again, those are kind of two really core cornerstones of what Hope for the Future and what our approach is built on. Being able to have those personal connections and develop those personal connections with your MP, and also ensuring that what you're discussing relates in some way to the constituency in which you're in, or your local area more widely. You know, those two elements are really key in order to reaching the successful outcome that, of course, we all want. So on the next slide, we've got some really valuable research resources which you can use, all of them completely free of charge, which you can use to get to know your MP on that personal level that I've just been referring to, and ultimately to know what makes them tick, you know, what interests they have, what are their passions, what are their kind of key policy areas that they are interested in. I'm not going to go into this in too much detail now, but from our experience, all of these are excellent research sources, and you'll be able to kind of go back and look at this slide after the session and look at them all in a bit more detail. So the next thing I am going to move on to is what are called tailored lobbying strategies, and that is just a fairly kind of wonky phrase, essentially for what are essentially MP profiles. We devised these profiles at Hope for the Future to provide kind of information on how best you as a constituent can engage your MP on climate issues, and they include kind of all those kind of those 5 central points that are listed on bullet points there. As you can see, it's a little small, but we've got an image of one that we produced for a constituent of James Murray, who is the Labour Cooperative MP for Ealing North, and you can see there is detail on his background and his constituency. I must obviously emphasise that we are able to write one of these for your MP if you wish, so please do get in touch with us or write in the chat box now if you think that one of these would be helpful for you. But we also do have a guide which we can provide, which will walk you through the process if you really want to do it yourself. So yes, we are really more than happy to help out in this area. If you so wish, please do let us know. So on the next slide, we've got a bit of information really about kind of what we call like kind of MP indicators on climate change. So using those sources that I've just covered briefly prior to this slide, after having done your research, this should give you a pretty strong indication as to how your MP thinks and feels about climate change. And essentially these are 5 indicators for exactly that, for exactly how your MP thinks and feels on the issue in question. So kind of we're on a scale kind of 1 to 5, and I'll briefly just kind of talk about 1 and 5. So MPs who are at number 1 are those who are kind of completely opposed to action on climate change. And these are really the parliamentarians who think that climate policy tends to be quite bad for the economy, and they will be MPs that prioritise all other issues, instead. So whether that be kind of issues of social policy, economic policy, or whatever, they will prioritise those over issues related to the environment and the climate. Examples really include the Conservative MP Steve Baker and the Labour MP Graham Stringer. Both of these individuals are trustees of a climate change denial think tank called the Global Warming Policy Foundation, and they tend to fit this bill of being really quite sceptical of taking action and who tend to, again, prioritise other issues first. If you jump right to the other end of the scale at number 5, these are MPs who are in total agreement about taking action to mitigate climate change, and these tend to be the individuals who believe that climate policy must be at the centre of all government decision making, and that it is simply not possible to address other societal issues such as poverty and inequality without bringing climate change into the decision-making process. So a couple of examples are, you probably be unsurprised to hear, the sole Green MP in the House of Commons, Caroline Lucas, the MP for Brighton, and also Clive Lewis, who is a Labour MP. So they're kind of looking at, well, not the extremes is not the right word, but kind of looking at kind of both ends of the scale. We tend to find now that most MPs fit in the middle and range from a 2 to a 4. But there's a few real key things to pick out about this scale. The first thing that we always say is that if you can meet your MP where they are and try to understand why they're at a certain number, rather than maybe criticising them for being at a certain number, that's going to be a lot more helpful. If your MP is at a number 2, obviously it's human nature in many ways. It'd be very tempting to be quite critical, or if they're at number 1, and to want to kind of be argumentative with them about it, and you know, seeking to kind of backing them into a corner. But what we really would advise is, again, using those sources I've mentioned on the previous slides, go and look a bit into their background, look a bit into their political career, look what they've said in Parliament, look what they've done in their community, look at their background prior to entering at the House of Commons, and try and just develop a wide understanding of why they're at that position. The second thing is that, as frustrating as this can be as well, you're unlikely to be able to move your MP more than kind of 2 points along the scale at once, which is why we've got those arrows going kind of from a 3 to 4 and a 4 to a 5. You know, what we really kind of advocate is that, you know, it's a journey in effect, and kind of progressing your MP from, you know, one number to the next may take multiple engagements. And yes, of course, the issue of climate change is something that demands really quite urgent action. But we find that, you know, taking that time to build your relationship with your elected representative will actually, in the long run, have the most, you know, positive consequence, and have the, you know, the best opportunity of you securing a positive outcome. And then the final thing to remember about this scale is that something which I'll talk about in a short while, actually, is that in order to make it work, in order to really have those successful engagements, specific asks are important as well, because they are able to help your MP move along the scale more efficiently as you're tackling a specific point rather than climate change as a whole. And smart asks in the context of carbon pricing is something that I will talk about in a bit more detail shortly.
Thanks, Tom. So yeah, we've learned all about the research. Now it's about how to apply that research to find that common ground between you and your MP. And again, we're starting with the why. It's so important. Why do we do this? Why do we focus on common ground? And the reason is that finding that common ground is a core tenet of effective communication and effective influencing. What we're trying to do is we're trying to build a relationship. So this graph is such a useful way to kind of consider that relationship. So on one side, we've got the concern with reaching goals, and on the other side, we've got the concern with the relationship. And you need to be concerned about both of those things in order to create change. So there's a really great quote that we use with this, and that quote is, if the relationship is good, everything else will become possible. We're not saying it's going to become easy, but we are saying it will become possible in a way that it wouldn't be otherwise. It's all about building that collaboration. So this graph is really helpful because it can help us see how we're trying to pitch each different engagement. The very first engagement might be more about the concern of the relationship, building that trust between you. And then gradually over time, it means you can spend more time focusing on your goals and outcomes, and less time just worrying about stepping on eggshells. So as you go on, then you can kind of build and build and build, and get to that point at the end, which is meaningful collaboration. We're trying not to be too goal oriented and too outcome focused, because then we'll just end up in a place where we're just totally in stalemate. The MP isn't listening to you, you're not listening to the MP, and no progress is being made. So yeah, that's where we're ending up. Fingers crossed, at the end of this process, that's where you'll be with your MP. This is another thing that we find really useful for kind of working out where you are with your MP, is to understand better their political values and the way in which they might be able to connect with climate change because of those political values. Conservatives are typically seen as more difficult to engage in climate issues, but that's not necessarily true. It's just about finding the right way to frame it. Climate change is not just a left-wing issue. And it's worth considering how you might talk by considering your own position on the kind of spectrum of values and the perspective of your MP, so that you can be careful about what language you use and intentionally use the right language to get on the same page as them. So I'm just going to kind of very quickly go through some of these. So for more right-wing MPs, for Conservatives, it's worth thinking about that idea of aspiring to a good life and connecting that to climate change. You know, a good, simple life where we're preserving our traditions, preserving our landscape. Those are good ways to connect to climate change. Things like we're trying to avoid flooding, we're trying to foster a good sense of community identity, create that good, simple life that we want. And that can be really important. But on the other hand, you might end up turning off a Conservative MP by really talking about a complete restructure of society, a grand theory of change. Those things really disengage Conservative MPs and right-wing MPs, whereas they might be really, really important for left-wing MPs. So we very, very often find that we're working with left-wing MPs who are maybe at 2 on the scale, not at all engaged in climate change, think that other things are more important. And then you start talking about social justice issues, equality issues, the way in which climate change disproportionately affects marginalized people, the way in which fuel poverty becomes a significantly larger problem as fuel prices rise, and like making more well-insulated houses and more renewable energy will help to alleviate that suffering. That can be so important for left-wing MPs and be such an important way to bring left-wing MPs into the conversation. And then again, thinking about those trusted messengers and the kind of trusted ways of engaging with things. So for more right-wing MPs, engaging with ideas around security and ideas around law and order work well, whereas things about protest will not be so successful. You know, if you're talking to your right-wing MP about XR, unfortunately, they might just stop listening. So it's worth thinking about that and thinking about who you want to be talking about instead. Maybe more the David Attenboroughs of the world, for example. I'm handing back to Izzy now. You're on mute.
Sorry about that, everybody. I'm just jumping in at this point with a quick reminder that most MPs and elected representatives are unlikely to have heard much about carbon pricing before, and they're very unlikely to be prepared to talk spontaneously about them in detail, not least because of the complexity, some of which you've covered today. So if you are trying to engage your MP on this issue, it's probably a good idea to send over some introductory information before the meeting that you have of your representative or the members of staff, so that they can read and familiarise themselves with some of the concepts we've covered. We've got some really good resources to help on this, as to hope for the future, and we're going to be following up with these after the session. But it could also be a good idea to familiarise yourself with some of the technical language that could crop up in those conversations. And in our beginner's guide to carbon pricing, we've compiled a list of phrases that people tend to use when talking about this topic, along with some handy translations in case you get thrown in at the deep end. There's a little snapshot on the screen at the moment. It's not exhaustive, but we really hope that that can prove useful in helping dialogue along with your MP. It's also worth considering if there are specific arguments that might motivate your MP's ideological interests. Hannah's touched on this in her previous slides, but for example, if your MP is on the left of the political spectrum, they're probably going to be more excited to hear about the revenue raising potential of a carbon pricing scheme, which, as we've mentioned earlier, could bring in 27 billion per year by 2030 and could be directed to a variety of causes, including funding public services like the NHS. By contrast, an MP on the right of the spectrum might be more intrigued by the scheme's market-based approach to solving climate change. The UK can harness the power of businesses to reduce our carbon footprint by giving the proper incentives they need to act. And if done properly, a well-designed carbon pricing scheme will enable the UK to plough ahead with this and promote green and sustainable growth, help us outpace other nations, and even help the UK to develop new low-carbon industries, which could become a really useful source of exports abroad as the world transitions towards a low-carbon future. Wherever the MP sits on the political spectrum, all MPs have a duty to represent their constituents. We're currently running a petition on the parliamentary website that calls for the implementation of carbon charges in the UK. And this allows you to see how many individuals have signed the petition in each constituency around the country. So it could prove a useful resource for this dialogue with your MP. You might want to look up how many people have signed in your constituency before contacting them, and then use that as a little bit of a hook when you get in touch. Even knowing an extra 1 or 2 people in a constituency support stronger carbon pricing can really help to convince an MP or other elected representatives that this is an issue that's worth them taking seriously. So whichever subject you wish to raise, it's important to tailor your lobbying approach to your MP's interest and position. And that's where Hope for the Future has come in and will continue to come in. So that's my cue to hand over the mic.
So what we often do is we kind of draw out this little Venn diagram, which is kind of a helpful way to like visualize it in your head. So on one side, you've got your agenda, you know, and broadly speaking, that'll just be like take action on climate change. It'll also be things like I'm particularly excited about carbon pricing, or I'm a very keen gardener, those kinds of issues. And then on the other side, you've got your MP's agenda. And no matter how far apart on the political spectrum you and your MP are, no matter how much you disagree, there's always that space in the middle ground. There's always space to find that common ground and issues to raise based on that common ground. What we say at Hope for the Future is it can be as narrow as a pinhead or as wide as the ocean. And it's just about finding the right thing and finding the right way to frame that thing. I think Izzy's examples right there is a perfect example of that, of like connecting the right place so that you can both find that common ground of talking about carbon pricing. We've got a little bit of an example of this, a little case study. And then after that case study, we'll just take a short break. So this MP is Alex Chalk. He was newly elected in 2019 and in 2017. And in 2018, we brought a group of constituents together to meet him. And he'd previously been very, very defensive of the government's climate change record. And then we started working with him more. We followed up with a schools workshop, which presented Alex with a variety of climate change campaigns from local sixth form students. And then we built that engagement even more. And we hosted a solar themed local event during which Alex Chalk talked about how the government should be taking a greater lead on solar power. And what we were doing there is we were building up these engagements based on what Alex Chalk is like, his career trajectory, kind of things he might be interested in connecting with, the kind of things that he totally is unable to connect with, his constituency, his personal interests, and also the interests of the community and the things that might be really beneficial to community and the constituents involved. And what we were doing there by doing those things, by increasingly asking these smart asks, which you'll hear about shortly, we were able to play a significant part in encouraging Alex Chalk to make climate change one of his top political priorities. And as a result of those engagements, Alex Chalk submitted a number of different parliamentary questions. And actually, he later went on to propose a bill to commit the UK to reaching net zero emissions by 2050. As you might know, the government backed that proposal in June 2019, which made the UK the first major economy to mandate a 2050 target by law, a net zero target by law, sorry. He might have done that anyway, but he might not have done, because when he shared this news on his personal website, Alex Chalk specifically thanked the people of Cheltenham for talking to him and making that issue a number one priority for him. He did a lovely quote here, which I'm not going to read out because it just feels like we're bragging about how important Hope for the Future is. But this is about that building those like real relationships with people, regardless of if they agree with each other or not, to take real action and to create real change. So I hope you're all having a nice time. We're just going to take a little 5-minute screen break if you want to go to the toilet or make a cup of tea, and we'll see you back here at 12:55. Thanks, everyone.
excellent question. Thank you for that, James. Much appreciated, because I'd forgotten that the recording had stopped. So thank you for that. So yes, you've done your research, you found your common ground. In this case, hopefully you selected carbon pricing as a topic of discussion, but obviously this could also apply to any other issue, relating to climate change, whether it be transport, housing, nature, or renewable energy, etc. But how do you and can you make that next leap and narrow down what is likely going to be a fairly kind of vast topic and narrow it down into precise asks that you put to your MP? And the way you do that is by ensuring that your asks are smart in this way. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about how you do this. So we've got an example smart ask on the right hand side there, and that is one that we wrote for a constituent of Liam Fox, the former cabinet minister and the current Conservative MP for North Somerset. And we wrote that precisely because we'd identified that he had a prior interest in carbon pricing. And it fits, each one of the SMART criteria. So just to kind of explain a bit more why that is the case. The ask is a specific one because it's asking him to submit one oral question on a specific topic. It's a measurable ask because when we ask MPs to submit oral questions in the House of Commons, we are able to check on the parliamentary record using the research sources that I showed you earlier to ultimately check whether or not the MP in question has kind of followed through with what they said they would do. It's an achievable ask because it's well within the remit of Liam Fox as a backbench member of Parliament to ask the government a question of this sort. It's a relevant ask, or it's a realistic ask, because again, as I've said, carbon pricing is something that Liam has discussed quite frequently and in quite significant detail before. And we also say that it's a timely ask because with the Global Climate Change Conference, COP26, taking place in Glasgow in November, it enables Liam to be seen as an MP who is championing climate action. So kind of just from looking at that ask and matching it with the SMART criteria, you can see how it kind of all fits into quite a neat question. The one thing that I will just say on this is that with COP26 taking place in November, there is somewhat a limited amount of time to actually submit what we call oral questions to ministers in the House of Commons beforehand, due to recess in Parliament and also due to party conference season. So it may be more feasible to go down the route of putting other asks to your MP, such as what we call written questions or asking them to write media articles. I'm conscious that we haven't really discussed about the variety of asks all that much. So again, for more detail on this, please ask any questions you may have in the chat box, or again, feel free to email Hannah or I about some more information and tips on smart asks. I think now I'm handing back over to Izzy.
Thanks, Tom. So I covered earlier in the session a little bit about the carbon pricing landscape in the UK currently and its weaknesses. And now I'm just going to elaborate that on a little bit more detail to try and shed light on what more can be done in the UK. So whilst the government is taking some action on carbon pricing, it's clear that there is scope for more. In our campaigning, we focus on 5 different priorities for reform. And number 1 is raising the price floor in the ETS. As mentioned previously, we're calling on the government to introduce a carbon price of £75 per tonne of CO2. And currently the UK has an auction reserve price, effectively a price floor of only £22 per tonne of CO2. So there is scope to raise this a lot further. And there's a variety of mechanisms and policy levers that the government can push on to achieve this. Number 2, we want to see the cap lowered. We and fellow campaigners have argued that the cap, and just to recap, the cap is the number of permits in the ETS, is too high, especially in its first year. and lots of us in the sector have been pressing the government to make sure that this is decreased. The government has said that it intends to align the overall number of permits with the government's legally binding net zero target by 2024, but there's nothing to stop them taking action to reduce this number of permits sooner rather than later, and it's in the interest of the planet for us to do so. So that's something we want to see happen quickly. Number 3, which we also touched upon in terms of the scope to have a hybrid system, is expanding the carbon pricing system as is currently. At the moment, only a limited number of sectors are included within the UK's ETS, only aviation, power generation and high energy industries like steel. And either including more sectors in the ETS or including fixed carbon prices on fuel in these sectors and other sectors in the future like agriculture and waste incineration could help create that hybrid system to reduce the UK's carbon footprint. And I should also just note that the amount of carbon price sectors that are currently covered by a carbon price at the moment actually only amounts to 1/3 of our economy. So although we have the UK ETS, it's actually covering less of our economy than more. So that's a really kind of key stat to bear in mind when talking about this with politicians, that 2/3 of our economy are currently uncovered by carbon pricing. Number 4, what more could be done is building carbon pricing into international trade. Again, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but one danger of carbon pricing systems is carbon leakage by importing products from countries with lower environmental standards. So it's really important that as the UK raises its own environmental standards through the implementation of a higher quality carbon pricing system, that we do not allow our manufacturers to be undercut by competition from abroad. And we can achieve this through the implementation of a border carbon adjustment. We've been pushing for this through our campaigning, particularly surrounding the G7 summit that was held last month. There's a lot of buzz about this, and hopefully it's something that will be on the agenda to discuss at COP as well. Which brings me nicely on to number 5, the final scope for doing more, which is success at COP. As discussed above, the Article 6 Paris Rulebook on carbon pricing is an essential component of the Paris Agreement, and without success on this issue, it's hard to imagine that COP can be much success. As hosts of the Climate Summit this year, we really do have a leading role in getting other countries to sign up to implement domestic systems, and well as levers like border carbon adjustments. So I'll pass back on to Tom now.
Thanks, Izzy. So again, similar to what I was just talking about a couple of minutes ago, we've got some kind of example carbon pricing smart asks here that we've kind of devised. Again, won't go kind of into a significant amount of detail at this minute in time. It's just more to give you the type of an idea of the type of asks that you can put to your MP on this issue. Obviously, they here are relating to Kwasi Kwarteng, who is the business secretary, and also to Alok Sharma, who is the COP president. And kind of I would contend that when pushing to engage with government ministers, they will be two that were fairly frequent in that, considering their remits and responsibilities. So again, more than happy to discuss this in more detail. But I'm next going to go on to discuss key opportunities for influence in Parliament and the opportunities for MPs to exert their influence through their activities in there. And essentially, there are kind of 4 fundamental ways in which this can be done. The photo there is of an MP called Janet Davey, who hosted a Westminster Hall debate on the regulation of heat networks, just to kind of demonstrate an example of the power that kind of backbencher MPs do have, and the ways in which they are able to bring issues kind of front and centre, and are able to really gain attention for issues that matter to them, whether on a local level or a national level. So the first one is to talk about parliamentary bills, or otherwise known as proposed laws. So obviously the government introduces new laws, which are called bills, while they work their way through Parliament and go through the process of becoming essentially legislation. MPs at different stages have the chance to scrutinise these bills in debates and in committees, which also consider policies in line-by-line detail. But the point is that each bill has to go through kind of numerous stages before it receives what's called royal assent. That is the moment at which it becomes law, and there is significant degree of opportunity for MPs to have influence in the overall outcome of a bill as it goes through that process. The second key opportunity that we've highlighted are departmental question times, and every week different government ministers are obliged to answer questions about their department's work in Parliament. You know, a Secretary of State or a Minister of State will simply kind of come to the dispatch box at the front bench in Parliament and answer questions, you know, for between 30 minutes and 1 hour. And this is a really excellent opportunity for you know, other MPs to hold ministers to account on their actions, or what can also be an opportunity to hold them to account on their lack of action as well. That's just as important. The third key opportunity comes in the form of debates, as I've just touched on there with Janet Davey. MPs can schedule debates on topics they are campaigning for. So again, these can be either what we call adjournment debates, which take place in the House of Commons chamber, or Westminster Hall debates, which take place literally down the corridor in the grand old Westminster Hall. And on the fourth key opportunity is through committees. So there are several different types of committee, and the last thing I want to do is kind of overcomplicate it unnecessarily. So I'll just touch on what we call select committees. They are really prominent committees who have quite significant roles within Parliament, and these are committees that check and report on areas ranging from the work of kind of government department to economic affairs. And frequently each committee will shadow a government department and will be kind of conducting multiple investigations, or should I say not investigations, inquiries. We'll be conducting multiple inquiries at once, which are public and require, you know, evidence to be submitted by relevant individuals and groups of people. And in the end, many can require an official response from the government, as well. So again, when bearing in mind carbon pricing and wanting to kind of, you know, develop your knowledge about how to lobby your MP with this issue in mind, always consider that these are key avenues of influence which you can go down and pursue, and which will, really kind of increase your likelihood of securing action, the positive outcome that we all want to see. And then I'm just going to briefly discuss the other, obviously, the really kind of key moment for influence in 2021 that we would say here. We've got a photo of Chris Stark, who is the Chief Executive of the Climate Change Committee, who is the government's, own independent advisor on climate change. And you can see there what he's saying about COP26 being a major milestone. And really, as I was touching on the slide when I was talking about Liam Fox and the ask being timely because of COP28 taking place, you know, what we'd say is that it's a really excellent opportunity as a means of framing the importance, of almost any issue on climate change, but obviously in particular this time referring to carbon pricing. COP26 obviously gives the government a chance to display its global leadership credentials, but also to encourage widespread introduction of really effective policies that make a green transition more affordable. And obviously carbon pricing mechanisms, as he has discussed in great detail, falls under this bracket really quite strongly. So kind of as a framing mechanism, COP26 is definitely something that you might want to bear in mind when raising this theme with your MP. And then to end from me, I will just talk briefly a bit about kind of MP motivation, and really lightly touch on the co-benefits of climate action as well. We've highlighted kind of throughout the years that we've been working with constituents, and that's now in the hundreds, for the future, and also working with MPs as well, that these are the really kind of core motivators and incentives that that you can put to your MP as a means of encouraging them to act. The first one is having improved knowledge and understanding. As Hannah said earlier, which I really loved, and I picked up on it, they essentially have to be a GP in the sense that they have to have such a broad and general knowledge about such a wide range of topics, and climate change is but one of them. So kind of anything that you wanted to discuss with your MP about, you know, by being able to frame it in the way of kind of collaborating with them and you being able to kind of educate them on different issues, that's a really effective way of getting them to engage with yourself. The second one is providing a constituency mandate. In some constituencies where the MP might be slightly more challenging to engage, there's no doubt about it that it does help if you can kind of have a coordinated effort amongst different groups, you know, whether that be kind of faith groups, youth groups, or just, you know, kind of climate action groups. By kind of, you know, collective efforts and the collective will of people coming together, that can really provide the mandate for the MP to act if they know that there's a large voice in the constituency pushing for change. The third one is good publicity. Yes, whether we like it or not, it is, you know, it is a reality that an MP or MPs do appreciate having the opportunity to have good publicity.
I think we've momentarily lost Tom there. I think it's
Leaving
me. Oh, there he is. Sorry, I just lost you for a second. You were in the middle of saying leaving a legacy of public service.
Sorry about that. My apologies. And that, yes, just if you can offer your MP an opportunity to leave that legacy of public service, that's also a really strong way of incentivizing them to act. No matter what we think, kind of as constituents, which obviously we all are, even if some of us obviously kind of, you know, work in this industry as well, we're still all constituents. You know, MPs go into the job because they believe in what they do and they believe in, you know, kind of making change for the better, and they believe in helping people, and they believe in, you know, ultimately progressing the ambitions of their country in whatever way that may be. There's undoubtedly much disagreement about how this goes, but ultimately that's what they're in the role to do. So that's a key way of incentivizing them, whether that be through maybe a community, you know, orchard scheme, which we've worked on before, or, you know, the opportunity for them to, you know, have a legacy with developing local active travel infrastructure for cycling or walking, whatever it may be. There's always usually a way that you can garner that. And then finally, the co-benefits of climate action, which I won't touch on any more on, than saying they cover kind of a variety of things from, you know, reduced healthcare costs to support for local economies through green jobs, the preservation of the natural environment, physical and mental health benefits, and free transport as well. So yeah, they're just kind of the key highlights really of what can be quite effective mechanisms of being able to motivate your MP. That's it from me. I will hand back to Anna.
Yes, so we've talked a lot about how to get to the point at which you're having a conversation with your MP. All of this has been preparation. Now it's time to prepare for the actual conversation. Again, we're starting with a why or a what. So what we're trying to get here is good influencing. And why do we want that? So fear is something that keeps us locked into old patterns. It's something that provokes an immediate survival response, a sort of a fight, flight, or freeze response. And it makes us immediately forces us to focus on ourselves and not be able to empathize with another person and find a collaborative solution. So we're trying to not strike fear into the hearts of our MPs. Instead, we're trying to generate these really nice feelings of safety, of trust, of well-being, because that's been proven over and over again to lead to that greater collaboration and create deeper change. So we're just going to look at a couple of like conversation techniques that you can kind of use in that meeting. And the first one is this way of structuring basically an elevator pitch. So something to say in the first 30 seconds that lays out your topic, introduce your topic, helps your MP understand where the conversation is going to go. And that's the purpose, hook and map model. So you start off with the purpose of the meeting. So in this case, I'd like to discuss the issue of air quality in our local area. And then you provide the hook, which is why should your MP care about this issue? You know, finding that personal local connection. In this case, I'm concerned that poor air quality in this area increases the risk of comorbidity of COVID-19 and other health issues for people in our community. And then finally, you map out where you want the conversation to go. I'd like to discuss your commitment to promoting clean energy and supporting the phase out of petrol and diesel cars. And the reason we do this is, first of all, it's been shown to be very reassuring to know what a conversation is going to be on, how it's going to go. But it also puts you in a position of like, it gives yourself a little bit of control. So if you find that your MP is really controlling the conversation, suddenly they're talking about how they cycle everywhere. You have an opportunity to bring it back and say, well, I'm really glad that you cycle everywhere, but I'm just really excited to be talking about this particular issue, and that's where I wanted our conversation to be about in this short amount of time that you've given us. And this is the bit as well. The thing about an MP meeting is there's only, you know, you've got a good understanding of who your MP is. There's only so much you can really prepare the actual conversation. And this is the bit that you can prepare, you can memorize, you can write it down and read it out if you want. And that can just be very reassuring. Because the rest of the conversation, unfortunately, is all about letting go of control and letting go of expectations. So in that first stage, you're using that purpose, hook and map model to introduce the conversation. But there's two more stages of the conversation in that meeting. The second one is the listening stage. And that's all about seeing and sensing things and letting go of expectations. You're trying to open up a dialogue, you're trying to really empathize with your MP and learn their perspective and understand them better. You don't know everything from the way that they tweet. So like really trying to get on the same page, really trying to understand each other. That's vital for good influencing. And then you're kind of moving into the third stage, which is the visioning stage. So you might have found out by listening that the topic that you wanted to talk about isn't going to work in the way that you thought it was going to work. And instead you're kind of in this new ground. It might not be what you've imagined, but you're trying to like work out where you're standing on something, crystallize a specific smart ask to go away with, and leaving the meeting with a commitment. So we've sometimes had meetings where the MP turns up and they just talk about a totally different issue. But you find out that they're way more willing to like move a lot more on that issue. So for example, I had a meeting recently where we meant to be talking about local electricity, and then the MP said something about wanting to be far more ambitious than the government currently is on like new build housing energy efficiency. And that's something that we didn't expect. We expected that MP to not be at all willing to question the government line, especially not in the first meeting. So then we followed that and we were taking the conversation in that direction. We find that happens quite often. But again, it's all about leaving with a commitment. It might be a very small commitment. You know, also remember where you are on that little graph. You might just need something that's more like tweet about it, promise to meet us again, do a small written question, maybe write a letter to the council saying that you support something like quite basic. But it's all about kind of progressing that conversation, ending positively, ending with something constructive, and moving on. So that's our kind of training. I hope you've really enjoyed it. I would just like, it's useful to kind of think about the next steps after today. So hopefully like this has really buzzed a lot of brain cells and you're excited to get going. In which case, you know, me and Tom, we're here to just work with constituents, provide any kind of support you need. So we're going to drop our email addresses in the chat, and you can book a call with us, you can email us to request a tailored lobbying strategy or any other support you might need. There's also a form on our website if you want to go on there and do it through that. And then you can use that tailored lobbying strategy in any of your own research and all of this training to decide where you want to focus on, and your initial asks, and decide kind of the direction. Hopefully maybe it's carbon pricing now that you know so much about it. And then you can get in touch with us again with support in writing to your MP. We're happy to draft things if you're not comfortable writing. We're happy to just kind of give some edits if that's what you prefer, anything you need really. and then go ahead and prepare for the meeting. And if you want, we can be at the meeting. We're just kind of here for whatever you need. We're here to grease the cogs of democracy for you. So that's it. Thank you so much. We've got a couple of questions in the Q&A to start with. And then we've got one question in the Q&A to start with. And then if anyone else has any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A or in the chat, wherever you prefer. So that first question is, it's definitely one for Izzy, which is, in your opinion, which country is setting a good example with its carbon pricing actions?
I think there are a couple of examples that I'd go to. Number one being Canada, probably the most famous example. Canada has committed to carbon pricing as part of its wider climate action plan. And it's got a fantastic model where it essentially redistributes the funds from its carbon tax back to citizens through adjustments to its tax system. So on income tax, it's reduced in line with the carbon price. That's slightly different to the model that we recommend, actually, just purely because we think that it's better to redistribute the funds in a way that is targeted towards decarbonisation. We think that's the best way to drive the behaviour change and ensure that those funds do help people with making the switch to green lifestyle changes. If you just redistribute funds, for example, in a 100% cash payment dividend or through tax cuts, there is obviously that chance that the money that is given back to people isn't necessarily used to green ends. But I think Canada's an example where that system of revenue recycling has really helped increase the public acceptability of carbon pricing and get people behind it. So we often point to it as an example of how governments can kind of leverage that revenue raising potential and the benefits that it has for citizens to drive towards really positive ends for the planet. I'd also just quickly point to New Zealand, who are really leading the world with their ETS and the sectors they extended it to. They haven't done it yet, but they're well on the road to having a plan to extend it to agriculture, which would obviously make a massive difference, given how much of a kind of difficult to tackle sector agriculture is for various reasons related to food security and kind of ensuring that farmers don't lose out. So I'd really encourage you to check out those countries, and we've got some interesting case studies of what different countries have been doing in our report annex, which I can circulate after the webinar as well.
Excellent, thank you for that, Izzy. I will just also reiterate that I put it in the chat, but just in case anybody has missed it, that all of these presentation slides on the recording will be available afterwards, and also we'll be sending around a feedback survey to identify how we can kind of improve on our training delivery moving forward. So we'd really love to hear from you all today about your experience of the session that we've delivered. If there are any other questions, please do feel free to ask them now. Thank you, Jonathan. We hope that you've all obviously found the session helpful, but yeah, as I said, if you can kind of think of any ways that we could have improved or gone about anything in a more effective way, as I said, we'd love to know. But if there are no questions, we are 4 minutes ahead of time, having started 4 minutes late, which is, yeah, I don't know what that's testament to, but I guess we should be pretty happy with that. So if there are absolutely no more questions, then we will end the session there. And as I said, on behalf of Izzy, Hannah and I, we really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. Okay, thanks everybody, take care.
Thanks everyone, bye-bye.
Right. Have you seen the question from James?
Yes. Excuse me. Yes, I have. Is James still here? Let me. Oh, James, yes, you are still there. I will take a look at that and I will email you about this one individually, if that's okay. If you've signed up, which obviously you have, because that's why you're here, I will seek out your email address and get back to you. And likewise for the other couple of people who are on now, happy to email with any separate questions and inform with any responses.
All right, I'm gonna stop the meeting then. Thank you everyone for coming. See you
Bye.
later.